Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I cannot complain. It is a sunny day in Boston.
Well, there you go. Y'all deserve it.
We do deserve it. We've also been getting some rain and we deserve that as well. We are in a multi-year drought. Where are you at?
I'm in DC in Tacoma Park.
How, I'm sorry I was not able to make the kickoff plenary. How did that go?
It was good. It was, a pretty broad-ranging discussion about, it's such an interesting time to be talking about the social compact because we're right in the middle of all the changes the Biden administration is doing. But of course, even the first 100 days isn't enough. And so, it was good, talk about freelancers. We talked about climate. We talked about, I don't know, just sort of what needs to happen at this moment. And Sharon Burrow was there, so we got a global perspective. Oh, Stacy's here. Let me let Stacy in.
Oh, good. I was going to say, I'm not usually the first one.
Yeah, it's because I have to let people in from the waiting room.
Okay. I'm going to close my door here.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Oh,
Hi, Ramah.
Hi, Tarso.
So Dania said that she would be here 5 minutes before we start. She had something, so.
I saw that, right. And if not, Lane, you can step in as moderator.
Good, but she'll do a great job.
After Ramah, after saying that the example I would give would center on Facebook, I couldn't help myself from including a little bit about YouTube.
Oh, no worries.
I was thinking about it. Well, in the area in which I work, there's such a cesspool of, white nationalist content, and such maybe the clearest indication of that being a core part of their business model, their profit model. So it seemed worth, riffing. I think I'm coming after you. So if you're talking about YouTube, I will add a compliment a little bit at the end before talking about some of Facebook stuff.
I have no problem with talking about the nonsense of YouTube as much as possible.
Yeah, it's something else. I was reminding myself about Google's most recent self-audit about all its content moderation efforts that basically doesn't even mention.
Yeah, that's the one that came out last year. Yeah, they failed to mention even YouTube.
Yeah, kind of amazing.
Yeah, I feel they don't, again, like I don't feel they get as much hate as Facebook. People are like Facebook and they roll their eyes and they hate Zuckerberg. But YouTube, which I think is a bigger platform in terms of video.
Well, exactly. I think this has a lot to do with the demographics of who uses these platforms. And, Facebook is a more ubiquitous platform for the governing and, advocacy kinds of networks and classes in the United States. And YouTube is just not where they spend their time. And so it's a bit out of sight, out of mind, even if it's has much grosser violations, right? Facebook is less goose-steppy in the way it drives, people into hard right content as part of its business model. So if on Facebook, of course, we're white nationalists on Facebook, but if on Facebook the algorithms drive, the conservatives from Fox is a news source towards Breitbart, so in sort of that's the spectrum. On YouTube, right? It's straight into the explicit white nationalist content of this sort that inspires mass shooters. So it's just a different spectrum.
Yeah.
But I do think there's an out of sight, out of mind, aspect to that. Most of your policymakers and their staff, for instance, are not trolling Parler to see what's happening there, but they're very aware of what's happening on Facebook.
Yeah.
Yes, love.
Hi, everybody. So Dania says that she will be here. She was going to be here 5 minutes before the session starts. So it's so good to have you all here. Thank you for being here, being part of this event. Hey, Michelle.
Hi, Lane. I just wanted to check in to see if there are any tech problems. Everything's going all right.
I think everything's fine. We're waiting still for our moderator. Dania said she was going to be here she said 5 minutes before the start, which we
Right.
passed.
Right.
So
Okay.
I'm giving her a minute to join.
Okay.
What is Stacy? Was me? Oh, that was you that was late? I don't see Dania over here. Waiting room. I wonder if her name could be showing up as a different name or something.
Have you emailed her?
No, I'm gonna do it right now. Is there a way to send a note to folks to let them know we'll start soon?
You can press message to folks in the waiting room, but if you and then you can send them a little message. It should be if you click on the participants link on the right side, it should say like admit all and then message. And if you put message in, you can
Okay,
type whatever in there.
I'm making everybody a co-host. You're already a co-host, right, Lily?
Yes.
Lane, Dania, I just texted Dania. She responded that Zoom crashed her computer. She's rebooting and will be here in a minute.
Okay, thank you.
I see her there. I just let her in.
Yes. Okay, there she is. You need a minute?
Still having tech issues. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. So nice to see everyone. Sorry for the tech issues. Glad to be here.
Glad you're here too. So I want to make sure before we go in, I've got the pronunciation for your name right. Is it Dania or Dania?
It's Dania.
Is that
And
Dania? Rajendra?
Rajendra.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. Thanks for asking.
Yes. Okay, so we'll go in a minute. Does anybody have any questions before we begin that you want to raise with the group?
We're gonna invite questions by chat, Lane, and I'm gonna
Yes.
sort them into, we have a agenda and I'll sort them into the questions I'm presenting.
Yeah. Good.
Also wanted to say thank you to you, Lane, and to Team Kalmanowitz.
Thank you.
Ditto.
Hey, sweetie, could you get me some? Of course.
So I had my second COVID shot this morning and I'm starting to feel slightly strange. So I just will forewarn my fellow panelists that if I hang back a little bit, that's why.
Congrats and condolences.
So let's see, we're at 2:32. If folks are ready, I'll admit people. We'll wait sort of a minute to get everybody in. I'll welcome people and then I'll turn it over to Dania. Is everybody ready for that? Yes, okay.
Dania says she's stuck on mute. By the way.
Dania is stuck on mute?
Yeah, she says on the chat.
Oh, okay. Do you want to take a minute to figure it out? It says I'm not allowed to unmute.
I think you
Okay.
made all of us co-hosts before Dania joined, so you may have to make her a co-host in order to have control over her mic.
Did that work?
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Now I'm going to admit everybody.
Awesome.
Okay. I think everybody's here. Welcome. I'm Lane Wyndham with the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown. On behalf of the Kalmanovitz Initiative, I'd like to welcome you to this panel, Company Town 2.0, that is part of a multi-day convening, Constructing a New Social Compact, a public forum on empowering the post-pandemic working class. We hope that you'll join us for a number of the sessions. We're recording today's session, and you can join the discussion by submitting questions through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And today's moderator is going to be Dania Rajendra, and she's with Athena, which is a terrific organization that is working to make sure that all of our digital lives are far more democratic. So now I will turn this over to Dania.
Thanks so much, Lane, and thanks to all of the amazing people at Kalmanovitz for putting together this incredibly wide-ranging convening. It's so nice to see some familiar faces and some new ones. As Lane said, I direct the coalition Athena. We're dedicated to delivering democracy by taking on all the ways that Amazon prevents our democracy from finally truly representing all of us and creates an economy that benefits basically only Jeff Bezos at everyone else's expense. I am super delighted to moderate a conversation that considers seriously the demands of multiracial feminist democracy and what it's going to take to veer from the current path of least resistance. Current trends suggest that this path of least resistance leads somewhere, I believe the technical term is gnarly, really pretty awful, a consolidated authoritarian economy and the martial, repressive, dangerous politics that protect it. There are a few historical examples we considered particularly relevant in considering the effects of such an economy and politics. Apartheid South Africa, Nazi Germany, the European colonial projects, such as the British East India Company. But for this conversation, we really landed on the American company town as our organizing paradigm. From mining to milling to manufacturing firms, the company in a company town in the 19th and 20th century United States held near total control over working conditions and living conditions of a single place, exerting power over regional economies and political possibilities, while being an integral node in a global economy even then. Resistance to the social, economic, and political control of these companies included the anti-lynching movement, the farmer labor parties, unions, of course, as well as eventually the imperfect and racially exclusionary expansion of the franchise to women. Alongside movements for liberation grew new American efforts such as Prohibition, the second coming of the KKK, Jim Crow, and the 1924 immigration restrictions, as well as the expansion of the American empire to Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Hawaii, among others. So there's a lot to consider in thinking about Company Town 2.0. And we've got 4 terrific thinkers / organizers to consider this consolidated authoritarian economy of today and the politics that might protect it. But we won't only do that. We'll tackle the questions about power we need to make a totally alternate path that this fantastic conference and many other excellent panels are lifting up, a new social compact, one that prioritizes human needs and communal flourishing. I'll introduce each panelist as they tackle our first question. Which company stands out to you as a good example of the Carnegie Steel or Standard Oil of our day, and why? And apologies in advance, I'm a mean timekeeper in the chat. I think Ramah, you're up first. And Ramah Kudiami is the Deputy Director of ACRE's, the Action Center for Race and the Economy's Crescendo project. She was previously the Deputy Director at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, where for 9 years she led and supported the BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions campaigns in solidarity with the Palestinians' people's struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. She dreams of a world without war, militarism, and borders, and believes we can create that world through a commitment to collective liberation and transnational solidarity with all those fighting oppressive regimes and systems. Ramah, who's your company in the contemporary company town, and why?
Thank you so much, Dania, for the invitation to be on this panel and that introduction, and really glad to be spending my afternoon with you all. So when I first read Dania's article about the company Town 2.0, the company that came to my mind was Google. And, you know, to me, I don't think Google gets as much attention as a lot of these other companies in kind of the tech world, even though I think they do a lot of horrible things that I'm happy to share about now. So like other big tech actors, Google makes money collecting and selling our data. So every day we are using Google. If you have a Gmail account, if you go on YouTube, if you do Google Maps, you're just giving a lot of data up to Google, and they will use that data to make a lot of money. So that can include something as simple as selling data to support personalized ads from other companies who want to sell you things. But also that Google, you know, Google's getting that data means Google gets to collaborate with a lot of really bad state actors across the globe to help survey, criminalize, police, and repress people, and particularly people of colors. So for example, law enforcement can obtain Google's location data on every single person who has nothing to do with a crime at all. Well, we're just in the vicinity of something the police are investigating. And, you know, we've seen this demand for these, what they're called geofence warrants, almost doubled between the years of 2017 to 2019. And one recent example of this is in Minneapolis. The police there obtained a geofence warrant to investigate activists that were at George Floyd protests, and data was shared of anyone within a geographical region of a store that was set on fire in the initial days of the protests. Google has also sold technology, for example, under the Trump administration to help them enforce his anti-immigration border policies. So they were hired by Customs and Border Protection to provide Google Maps software. I think the contract was for like $2 million, and then also cloud services to help, again, enforce immigration policies at the US-Mexico border. And what Google's doing is not only limited to within the US. So for example, recently there was a story that came out that Google was cooperating with police in India and giving them access to private communications happening via Google Docs by activists who are fighting climate change there. So that's, again, we use Google Docs every single day. It could be as simple as we're trying to plan a party to like we're planning, you know, a protest, though I hope most people doing that stuff is happening on other places like Signal. But for things we're not too worried about getting public, I don't think we think that Google itself is just going to just hand over the information to these forces and really, again, become such a big part of the government itself that they just are a wing that is helping investigate activists against them. And one thing I'll kind of end on is yesterday, Congress held a hearing on algorithms featuring the policy folks of Facebook, Twitter, and Alphabet, which is like the bigger parent company that Google and all the other things fall under. And a former design ethicist at Google was mentioning how the business model of these platforms is to create a society that is addicted, outraged, polarized, performative, and disinformed. That's just the fundamentals of how it works. And one of the campaigns we run at ACRE, the Action Center on Race and the Economy, is around YouTube and YouTube's role in spreading particularly Islamophobia and anti-Muslim violence. And again, that business model is built on pushing white supremacist and right-wing contents because they want users to keep clicking. And for users who are watching anti-Muslim videos, that is what they're going to get recommended. So, us, we might be watching cooking shows and makeup tutorials and interviews with our favorite athletes. And that's what we get, when we finish the video, they're like, here, watch this. Well, for the white supremacists and the Islamophobes, they get just more of that content. And YouTube knows that they're making a ton of money off of that because that's how ad works. You just keep people involved to keep them on the website, keep them clicking and watching. And in 2020, for example, YouTube had $20 billion in ad revenue. So that's how much Google made from all of this. And this has very deadly consequences. So last month, we launched a campaign called #Who'sTube to point that YouTube continues to platform well-known Islamophobic bigots and organizations. And even though, again, 2 years ago we launched a campaign on the anniversary of the Christchurch massacre, which if folks know, reports have been found that the shooter who killed about 50 people at a mosque in New Zealand, 2 mosques in New Zealand, was inspired by watching YouTube videos. And YouTube unfortunately allows these white supremacist, violent actors to be on YouTube and to have channels on YouTube and post videos, while at the same time, making it more difficult for the rest of the users to actually be safe on the platform, because this is, this is who YouTube decides to put its energy around, and that's who's making them money.
Thank you so much, Ramah. I put a link to the Who'sTube stuff in the chat, but feel free to add in some more. Next up, Stacy Mitchell. Stacy Mitchell is the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which produces research and develops policy to counter corporate control and build thriving, equitable communities. Stacy's written extensively about the dangers of monopoly power, and if you haven't read it, there's too many amazing links to put in this chat box, but don't miss, she's the author of a book, Big Box Swindle, and several in-depth reports, including Amazon's Stranglehold. Stacy's an advisor to policymakers and helps design policies that curb corporate power and strengthen community-based economic systems. In addition to her very important work at ILSR, Stacy co-founded the Athena Coalition and serves on the board of the Maine Center for Economic Policy and lives in Portland, Maine. Stacy. Who's your town company?
Yeah, it's going to be tough to guess. So it's Amazon, of course. And thank you so much for that kind introduction, and to be part of this wonderful conference is terrific. And it's nice to see everyone here. Yeah, so Amazon, we think about Amazon as a retailer primarily, as a company that delivers stuff to our doorsteps. But Amazon, of course, is so much more than a retailer. They are a huge retailer. They capture more than half of all spending online. And of course, online spending is increasingly the way that we do our shopping for everything. They are also a major logistics and shipping provider. Just in the last few years, they have grown their package delivery operation to a size that now rivals UPS and is beginning to rival even the post office in terms of e-commerce packages that they deliver. And they're delivering packages not only for themselves, but for other companies. Amazon is also like the future of how we interconnect with the web through voice. Voice is increasingly the way that people are going to access services, information. It is the basis for all of the so-called smart homes and increasingly smart offices and workplaces. All of the devices that are being connected, from dishwashers to speakers to other things to the web. Amazon's vision is to be the platform for all of that, the interface for all of that, and it's doing that through Alexa, which has about 70% of the voice market. And of course, there's also Amazon Web Services, which accounts for about 40% of the world's cloud computing capacity. Not only data storage, but a growing share of computing by big companies is happening in the web and by governments and all kinds of people. And that increasingly happens. Most of that activity is happening on Amazon Web Services. So a huge number of large and small businesses and governments and other entities are riding on Amazon's infrastructure. And if you turned off AWS, you would essentially turn off a lot of the internet. And the list goes on and on and on. Amazon owns Twitch, a major gaming platform, also increasingly a platform for white supremacy and other kinds of hate activity. They've got a big national chain of grocery stores that they're beginning to unroll. Not only do they own Whole Foods, but they're building a whole nother chain of grocery stores. They're big into the financial sector. They have a payments system. They're moving into healthcare. They have tons of operations in terms of surveillance, and not only the Ring doorbell systems, where they're partnering with police departments across the country, but also they've got a satellite service that offers, that they're marketing to both military and police clients, that offers the ability to do near real-time surveillance of, for example, crowds. And I could go on and on and on. We could spend the rest of this hour like listing off all of Amazon's businesses, all of the ways in which it has its tentacles in all sorts of different parts of our economy and our society. To just say what the problem with this kind of centralized control is, I think there are really four. One is that Amazon has a lot of power over labor, and this is particularly true, of course, in the logistics and warehousing space. Amazon controls about a quarter of that workforce, which gives them just unprecedented power to set terms and wages. And indeed, they have really been a leader, if you can put it that way, in precarious temporary work and really creating a work environment that is, reminiscent of the 19th century. A lot of it driven on piece rates and a lot of things that the labor movement worked to get rid of, Amazon has brought back. Second, Amazon is really reorganizing our material economy and has positioned itself such that it is the infrastructure for maybe most of all other businesses in the economy. If you're a business that makes or sells anything and you want to reach the online market, you have to sell through Amazon's platform. And that means you give them a view into your activity, you give them access to all of this data about your business and your customers, data that they can use to compete against them. And it also means that you pay them a tax, essentially, through the fees that they charge for access to their platform. This begins to show how it is that Amazon has amassed so much wealth, as it has essentially created the rail lines or the pipelines or whatever infrastructure metaphor you want to use of the modern economy, and therefore has been able to set up toll booths everywhere. The online shopping platform is only one piece of this, of course. You can imagine the future that Jeff Bezos has in mind, where every other business, you want to sell online, you have to do it through Amazon. If you want your stuff to arrive on people's doorsteps, you have to use Amazon Logistics. If you need to use the cloud, it's Amazon. The infrastructure for everything. And what this means is that other businesses are no longer independent. This is not an open market. It's not a market that's governed by public rules. It's not even really a market. It's a private arena run by an autocratic entity that can decide who wins and who loses and what are the terms by which you can operate. All of this, to come to point number 3, Amazon is using this incredible power to reorganize the geography of our country, to pick winning places and losing places. We can see that in the location of their headquarters outside of Washington, D.C., and the tremendous displacement that they're causing there. And then we can also see it, for example, in small communities across my home state of Maine, where local businesses is disappearing and there's no economic activity. And finally, all of this is a huge threat to democracy. Not only a threat because you have this huge power that has a lot of control over government and influence over government, but Amazon's very activities, it is increasingly regulating our markets. It is increasingly regulating us as a form of autocratic power. So very much the company town. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Stacy. So much more to say about Amazon always. But on we move to additional nefarious actors. Tarso, I'll invite you to talk about which company is ruling our company town now. Tarso Luis Ramos is the executive director of Political Research Associates, a social justice think tank that tracks right-wing authoritarian and anti-democratic movements. Tarso has been researching and challenging the US right wing for 30 years. At PRA, Tarso has launched major initiatives on anti-Semitism, misogyny, the far right, and law enforcement, authoritarianism, white nationalism, and other threats to democracy. Sadly, there are more. Before joining PRA in 2006, Ramos served as founding director of the Western States Racial Justice Program. Tarso has recently served as an activist in residence at the Barnard Center for the Study of Women. And together with me, I am lucky that he is my co-author of this Company Town 2.0 piece that kind of kicked off the idea for this panel. So Tarso, who's your Standard Oil or Carnegie Steel?
Well, thank you, Dania, and my co-panelists. It's great to be part of this this session. And is that long and generous bio suggests the work I do is really focused on countering anti-democratic movements. And so my organization, Political Research Associates, comes at this question of the resurgence of monopoly power, oligopolies, and so forth through the lens of the rise of authoritarianism more generally, in the ways in which these companies contribute towards the rise of authoritarianism, whether in the United States or globally. I want to bring Facebook into this conversation, but I can't resist saying a little bit more first about an example already given having to do with Google's platform of YouTube, because I think some of the lessons there cross into broader things we wanted to address here. As Ramah was pointing out, white nationalism is very good for YouTube's business, but in fact is a key part of its profit model. And it's also a public relations problem, right, for YouTube. And so we find ourselves having public accountability conversations about content moderation or harm mitigation rather than root causes. And I think that this is something I hope we can come back to in terms of what does it mean then actually to contest here. It's a problem that I think reflects the challenge of governing level power that these monopolies and oligopolies have that drive us into a discussion about mitigating harm rather than transforming the root causes. So if I could add Facebook to the discussion, it has similar, if somewhat less goose-steppy model of pushing conservatives into harder right content. So Facebook profits from engagement, eyeballs on content, and studies of the platform show that conservatives' engagement increases when they engage with harder right content. It turns out that's not so much true for liberals and progressives, but so for instance, engaging with content from Breitbart or other sort of ultra-nationalist platforms rather than Fox News even. So the profit model of these mega corporations is deeply tied to and is accelerating the rise of authoritarian movements, including by developing profit models, right, that derive larger and larger segments of audience into far-right content and ways of looking at the world. We're all familiar with the scandalous use made of Facebook by Russian bots and the like. But for folks who've been following, Facebook's platform has been notoriously used in recent years to foment ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya people in Myanmar and also anti-Muslim attacks across the Indian subcontinent. And so the scale of danger represented by these kinds of models goes well beyond what we've so far seen in the United States, notwithstanding the awful example Ramah gave of the Christchurch shooter. I guess what I want to say is that's just on the content and consciousness side of things, which is of course of vast significance. So I don't mean just in a diminutive way. I mean that these companies fuel authoritarianism in multiple other ways, such as by driving immiseration through such severe wealth and income inequality as to require more robust policing to quell dissent and unrest. Who's going to protect the ill-gotten gains of the 1%? And of course, many of these big tech companies that make up an oligopoly of sorts, whether Google, Amazon, Palantir, is, as Stacy started to indicate, provide the technology that powers the surveillance and national security state, from predictive policing models to facial recognition, tech to Amazon ensuring surveillance arrangements with local police departments. These companies are to the current national security state as GM and IBM were to Germany's National Socialist regime. So the resurgence of monopolies and oligopolies and of American oligarchy also drives us towards anti-democratic, authoritarian social, economic, and political arrangements. So I know we've been talking a lot about the role of big tech, but the role of big tech is beyond the immediate business model in the ways it engages the state, the ways it engages policing and surveillance and so forth. Back to you, Dania.
What? Okay. So I'm hearing some about surveillance as a through line, both as it prevents people from organizing. I might say Pinkertons are a historical example, but as you may know, Amazon has hired the actual Pinkertons, which are still around. But I think, Michelle, as you're going to talk about as a curb on our imaginations for our democracy. Michelle Miller is the co-founder of coworker.org, a digital-first organization for people to shift power in their workplaces and transform the economy. Since founding it in 2013, Michelle and Coworker have nurtured the growth of global employee networks who have won paid parental leave at Netflix, scheduling reform at Starbucks, and changes to Google's code of conduct, among many other policy changes in workplace across multiple sectors. Coworker has also provided a critical organizing hub for essential workers during the COVID-19 pandemic, hosting more than 300 campaigns for hazard pay, store closures, and access to protective equipment in food service, logistics, grocery, and hospitals. Before co-founding Coworker, Michelle spent a decade at SEIU, where she used creative media and the arts to advance union campaigns. She sits on the boards of Arts and Democracy and the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research and lives in Brooklyn. Michelle, who is your suggested company in the company town, and help us wrap these nefarious actors together?
Thank you, Dania. I could go on and talk about all of the companies that have already been listed, but I decided to go with a little bit of a dark horse, which is Oracle. Oracle is a company that mostly focuses its energy on attracting contracts with businesses. And they both create lots of different kinds of software used both to manage consumer and citizen relationships with companies and in state and federal agencies, and also to do basically like the automation of management of entire supply chains and what they call human capital, what we call people who work for companies. And most of the companies that they serve are the companies that we don't think of as technology companies. They are the brick and mortar kind of companies, like we think of FedEx, Wyndham Hotels, Outback Steakhouse. Pfizer is also a consumer of Oracle's services. And in addition to providing all of these bits of software that manage productivity, that manage insider threat risk, that basically engage in continuous endless surveillance of the people who both use their services and work in the companies that they work with. They also helpfully provide cloud infrastructure. So they also store and process all of the data that's extracted from the people that work for the companies that they provide services to. And they are basically, their primary competitor is Amazon. They go up against Amazon in bids to provide cloud services to places like ICE, DOD, and various national security agencies. And what I think is important about thinking about Oracle, before I move on to my second point, is that they kind of provide this quiet infrastructure that and deploy software across about, they say, 30,000 different companies, in addition to federal and state agencies, that set labor standards effectively through the way that the software manages performance, productivity, and creates checks on insider threats. And that is built on data and algorithms that we know have been proven on more than one occasion to reinforce pre-existing racial and gender disparities. And so when you think about that, you start to really think about the fact that addressing the proliferation of the software and the kind of implementation of the surveillance state is not necessarily about thinking about one company or one sector, but really thinking about a set of behaviors that have been somewhat accepted as part of the course of doing business, which are behaviors around domination, behaviors around this kind of continuous surveillance, behaviors specifically around the monopolization and the collection of data as a way of having a competitive advantage. I, again, like I really think Oracle has flown under the radar because they're kind of like dowdy and old fashioned and hard to see, but they are essentially providing this like fundamental infrastructure that is going across multiple companies and following people in the various ways in which they interact with both, again, state and local agencies to acquire public benefits. Water and electrical utilities are often using Oracle software, and all of the things that we need in order to live our daily lives. And Coworker takes a particular interest in this because we have been really not just thinking about what are the impact of these kinds of surveillance technologies on people's working conditions, but on their broader ability to engage in freedom of association and the right to organize. Like, what does it mean when technology is watching you in a variety of different moments of your life and in different ways in which you interact with the services that you need to access? Like, what does it mean that we have software that kind of creates a set of standards and a norm of behavior in which people are expected to engage in? And what are the norms of behavior? Those norms of behavior are also often norms that are related to whiteness, are related to the dominant culture, and create systems of punishment and exclusion when you deviate from those sort of characteristics or behaviors in using the systems. So I already got the 1 minute warning. I will just close by saying I did not get to my second point. But that when you replicate this kind of closed system of software that talks to other software, manages behaviors, it starts to close down the ability of people to use those same systems as communications infrastructure, to share new ideas, to imagine new possibilities. And I think what we're going to get to next is this like question around like, how do we think differently? And if we want to engage in kind of transformational movement building, we actually have to also be creating the places where people have the opportunity to engage in freedom of association and imagine something bigger, which is very difficult to do in contexts which are completely dominated by the interests of a few companies.
Yep. I'm going to invite us all to take a quick deep breath. That's a lot. Happily, here in Company Town 2.0, we don't have to choose which company is the company. Actually, all the companies are the company. And these companies reveal quite a bit, I think, about how we got here and what this kind of power that they have over what it's like to work for or under them. But as we think about the original company towns, I'm thinking about the kinds of social engineering and social control that were a hallmark of those times, right? That's where if you might have gotten pregnant out of wedlock, the company might boot you and your entire family from your employment and your home, right? Like that kind of, if the company didn't see you in church, you were in trouble. There were that kind of level of social domination that we think about with company towns is as revealing, I think, about the structures that we're talking about now. So I don't have a lineup, but I do think, Tarso, your question about root causes, or Ramah, as you talked about it in our previous conversation, kind of how is this baked in, that those patterns of dominance baked in to the way in which these companies have emerged as such power players and crowded out competition and functional local economies. Let's talk about that for a minute. What do these companies reveal about how we got here, root causes, and how these kinds of dominations are baked into the system? Who wants to go first? I mean, I'm not above calling on one of you. I know you all have great thoughts about this.
So you don't have to call.
Yeah, Ramah. Awesome.
Thanks. So at ACRE, the Action Center on Race and the Economy, we do our work and very clearly say that we do our work at kind of the intersection of racial justice and Wall Street accountability, and really talking about, this idea of racial capitalism being what we need to take on. So we take on the financial actors such as banks, private equity firms, and corporations that are really responsible for pillaging communities of color, devastating the working class, harming the environment. And, as folks have alluded to, in order to be able to know how we fight back, we need to know kind of the root causes of how our current economy is at a place where these companies we all mentioned have so much power. And if we think about racial capitalism as this framework, it helps us understand what the underpinning of the US economy has been from the start. So we're talking about, the genocide of indigenous people and the theft of their land. We're talking about, enslaving African people and stealing their labor. We're talking about exploiting and underpaying immigrant laborers, throughout the entire history of the US. And obviously there's the angle of US imperialism and the stealing then of resources abroad as well. And that's all part of it. And today, a lot of the companies we talked about are tech companies. So if we think about, these tech companies making money for mostly white executives, collecting and selling data, a business model that causes direct harm to people of color, that makes sense in terms of the roots of the US as a white supremacist state. And then who has the political and social power to actually ensure there are policies benefiting them, and not instead of rating them down. And one particular example I want to just think through that we're trying to think through in our work in terms of the role of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry and complicity of corporate power there is something to note. Like many of these tech companies really were only established within the past 25 years. And again, we use them for innocent things like, we use a drone to take pictures from above, or we use YouTube to, again, watch cooking shows, and Facebook to keep in touch with our family. In reality, a lot of this technology plays harmful roles in surveillance, law enforcement, border militarization, imperialism, and actually that industry grew hand in hand with the global war on terror, which continues to this day to wreck Black and brown communities all over the globe, particularly Muslim communities. So again, from drone technology to facial recognition to data fusion centers, so much of that technology was deployed in a post 9/11 world. And I think there's like an interesting, story there in terms of how these industries really grew together. And again, how from the Department of Defense to the FBI to ICE, to drug enforcement agencies really have all of these contracts and deals with Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Dell, HP, IBM, Facebook, like for a lot of money. And that's how they, that industry of more criminalization, will really help them grow. And the last thing I'll say on this is just like, I would urge people to check out a new report some of my colleagues put out last week called 21st Century Policing, the Rise and Reach of Surveillance Technology. I'll drop a link because you'll learn more in terms of like how now in the face of demands to defund the police, some people are like, well, instead of like having actual police officers, what we'll do is just like, open the door to monitor communities through other means. And that means more money actually for police departments. But that's a way people think like, well, the problem is, the physical appearance of police officers. But the reality is no, the whole idea of like monitoring communities and then creating opportunities for private companies to profit from the sales and contracts from this actually causes harm as well. And we need to like really push back on this idea of letting policing continue to grow unchecked, because now it's just done in a different way than what is traditionally has been done.
Thanks, Rama. Stacy, will you take a crack at this too, and maybe wrap in some of Benjamin's questions about manufacturing and how Walmart is and is not like, I mean, how Amazon is and is not like Walmart.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think my organization, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, or ILSR, we are doing a lot of work on trying to resurrect anti-monopoly as a framework and a set of potentially quite vigorous policy tools for addressing some of what we're talking about here. So in terms of root causes, I tend to look back at this period in the 1970s and 80s when we really had a kind of new ideological framework take over our thinking about political economy. And it was a framework that in part was this notion that, markets get to govern themselves. We should get government out of the way, that corporations will deliver if left on their own, that whole way of thinking. But also, very specifically, and that broader way of thinking then sort of infected a lot of different areas of policymaking and had a lot of different kinds of manifestations. Within antitrust policy in particular, there was at that time this sort of radical shift that really turned antitrust enforcement on its head. For the preceding decades, antitrust had really been about dispersing power and structuring markets in ways in which no entity was allowed to amass too much power, and that there were a variety of purposes to antitrust, including the notion that if you're going to have a democracy, you have to limit concentrations of private economic power, that's an absolute essential, and that in and of itself is the goal. In the 70s and 80s, this idea sort of took hold in the 70s among policymakers, and then was codified and implemented under Reagan, and then repeated with every administration since, both Democratic and Republican. This idea that the only goal of antitrust should be efficiency, and we can sort of measure efficiency in terms of low consumer prices. That's how it often gets talked about. But if bigger companies are more efficient, then we should let them merge. We should let them take over. The only thing that matters in terms of antitrust policy. And, in effect, because baked within that idea was this notion that bigger is better, we went from having policies that were suspicious of concentrated power and actively opposed to it, to having policies that actually favored monopolization and favored concentration. Sorry, just having a problem with my video. And so that's sort of part of where I think we have a root cause to really look at it in terms of policy. Amazon, Jeff Bezos founded Amazon in the context of this changed world, and he very specifically took advantage of the opportunities that were opened up to engage in predatory behaviors that would have drawn antitrust scrutiny in an earlier era. So he engaged in predatory pricing. For example, the first 3 years that Amazon was in business, the company lost $6 billion selling books at a loss. Very quickly took over the book industry, now commands more than half of all book sales, is not only a major book retailer, but is also a major book publisher. So increasingly this important piece of our economy and the flow of ideas is dominated by this one company. Did that because he just simply lost a lot of money backed by Wall Street, and smaller companies couldn't do the same thing. And so they went under in droves. He's done that consistently all across Amazon's history, taken over one market after another through that technique. There are lots of other ways in which Amazon has exploited these shifts in antitrust policy to dominate one market after another. and in general has taken advantage a lot of government subsidies, tax breaks. We talk about Amazon all the time as though the reason it dominates is that, it's such an inventive company, and, Jeff Bezos, the genius, and all this sort of thing. But in reality, from the very beginning, Bezos made exploiting and gaming government to his advantage a key part of their strategy. And then just sort of quickly on the question around Amazon and manufacturing, and is Amazon sort of a new version of Walmart? On manufacturing, absolutely. They have thousands of brands. They make all kinds of things from batteries to clothing. They have many apparel lines. They're increasingly producing private label food products. They have a bazillion products. So they do a lot of manufacturing. They, of course, make devices as well, like the Fire TV and the Echo speakers and all those kinds of things. A lot of their brands are under other names, so you wouldn't necessarily know that you're buying an Amazon-made product, but in many cases you are. They use a lot of the data that they gather on the site from other businesses to actually copy their products, make their own version, and then give themselves superior placement on the site. So that's been documented quite a bit, and is a good illustration of the basic conflict of interest of when you own the infrastructure and you also compete on that infrastructure. In terms of whether Amazon is like Walmart, it is like another order of magnitude. So no, it is not like Walmart. I think Walmart dominates certain parts of retail. They are, and particularly, a dominant grocer. Amazon is not particularly focused on dominating markets per se, so much as it is focused on replacing markets, on being the market, if you could still call it that. So that it owns the infrastructure, and in order to participate in the economy, you have to do so on its infrastructure and on its terms. And so I don't think you can really call that a market anymore. It's certainly not something that's governed by democratic rules. Instead, it is this sort of private space that is run by Amazon, where it is consistently advantaging its own interests in a variety of different ways, and where all the other participants there are subservient to it and totally dependent on its rules. And so in that sense, the threat that Amazon poses, both to the notion of any sort of equitable economy and also to the notion of democracy, is very fundamental and much more significant than even Walmart.
Thanks, Stacy. Michelle, I feel like there's a through line there around those patterns of domination that you were talking about earlier, and what Stacy was just ending with, and how that's a fundamental challenge to democracy. So maybe that's a place to pick up on.
Yeah, as Stacy was describing the aim of Amazon as being, just like this creation of markets and of a very specific kind of market behavior, I was thinking about the akin behavior by Google and Facebook to essentially become the media, and to constrain quite significantly in an effort to basically monopolize all ad dollars that are potentially available, that both Google through search and Facebook through newsfeed have made it so that anybody who wants, most anybody who wants to actually communicate with either other individuals and their networks, or through the use of media companies, media platforms, has to do it on the terms set by Google and Facebook. And when what Ramah and Tarso described about the ways in which these platforms specifically cater to the proliferation of white nationalism and hate and violence, and that they are actually designed for that, what we know from a ton of the media manipulation research is that that people really learned how to game those algorithms, like on the, not just on the, it's not just a matter of the proliferation of that kind of hate and disinformation, but it is also about the constraining of the ability to express a variety of sets of ideas about what the world might be able to look like. And you combine that with the fact that you also have an entire media ecosystem that is effectively dominated by private equity and venture capital. It really constrains the ability to express new ideas. It constrains the amount of money that gets invested in things like labor reporting, critical investigations about corporate behavior. We know that Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Like there are all of these efforts by these giant tech companies to also stake their claim in the media landscape. And when I think about that from the perspective of like where we've been able to make gains in the history of working class organizing and specifically organizing among communities of color, it is through the creation of media ecosystems where people can communicate with one another, where they can share information, where they can develop their own stories and visions that of the things that are happening in your own life. Because what you know is that the mainstream and dominant media ecosystems are not going to tell those stories, that they are designed to cater to the status quo. And so I think what makes me particularly nervous in this moment is that in a prior context, you at least had varied distribution system, person-to-person distribution systems, community convening places, ways to get that information out. Whereas right now, most of our relational and communication systems, both between people as individuals and between groups, are effectively dominated by these platforms. And so if you want to engage in organizing, you probably have to do it in some form or fashion through Facebook if you want to reach a lot of people, or you have to do it through Google, or you have to do it through Twitter. And that is an extremely dangerous context when we know that those platforms are set up to serve white nationalist interests, the most violent behavior that on the internet, instead of serving the good of the people who are trying to engage in organizing. And they make money off of our efforts to try and join together to actually take on their power. And so I really think that it is that these questions around media policy and media domination are actually ultimately also questions of building multiracial working class power in this country, and that they should be considered a part of the policy work that we're doing to advance a kind of transformational view of what this country can be.
Wow, thank you. I'm gonna take a minute of moderator privilege to say that I think that akin to that, perhaps, but Michelle, you'll correct me if you don't agree, is the need for offline independent spaces, which have often been independent business, right? As you're talking about what working class communities, and especially working class communities of color, need in order to build movements for freedom, right? We need that media ecosystem, which sometimes used to be our own media, right? But there's also like, we wouldn't have queer freedom without Stonewall. Stonewall was a queer bar, right? Like we wouldn't have, we wouldn't have, you know, so much of the Black freedom movement without Black farmer co-ops, or the ability of civil rights folks to protect one another from the pressures of the local white power structure through the economy. And so when we talk about the need for independent space, that's really inclusive of independent business, I think, in some ways that we often, at least as a unionist and a labor person, I don't generally think of in those terms. And so that's something I wanted to bring forward, and also made me think, Tarso, about the places in which people congregate to build freedom against repressive regimes, including some here in the United States. So I thought maybe that'd be a through line for you, Tarso. And then if you could kind of head us towards then what do democracies need? What do working class, multiracial, feminist working class efforts for freedom need in order to flourish? And then we can kind of head towards the questions about new social compact after that.
Sure. Well, maybe it would be helpful to step back a little bit from the US context just for a moment, right? The US is part of a global set of systems, and we are all on this planet at this point living through what we could call the third great march of authoritarianism since the start of the 20th century. And there are a number of drivers to this that relate to the conversation that we're having today, but just to put that in a little bit more relief, right? Anywhere where we see the kind of crisis of liberal democracy, the rise of ultra-nationalist parties, politicians, and state systems, and we're at a point where a majority of the world's population is now governed by autocratic or autocratizing governmental systems, and that percentage is growing. It has grown dramatically over the last 15 or so years. We see at least three key drivers, not always in the same proportions, right? One of the things that we see is severe economic inequality, largely driven by neoliberal austerity policies, but sometimes by other arrangements of transferring and concentrating wealth in the hands of very few folks. And we're talking to a large degree about some of how that's happening in the United States and the authoritarian tendencies within it. A second driver that we're seeing is the rise of mass religious conservative movements that provide a popular base for repressive governance and policies and politics. And we're seeing the rise of racial and ethnic nationalism. And we have all three of these things happening in the United States. And in a way, when I was listening to Stacy earlier, talking about the pivot away from the regulation of monopolies and trusts in the United States, in the 70s and 80s, and the ushering in of Reaganism, that's really the beginning, the opening of a set of doors in the United States for all three of these, the resurgence of all three of these tendencies that are in some ways mutually reinforcing. As we can see from mid-century fascism, especially in Germany, the concentration of corporate power into monopolies facilitated the rise of that form of authoritarianism, totalitarianism in the form of fascism, and made it easier for an autocratic ruler, to gain control of other power centers, both economic and social and military, ultimately through collaboration with those monopolies. And so there are some object lessons there about the ways in which concentrations of corporate power play out in devastating ways, both in the workplace, but also in terms of the way that the social order is constructed. In the United States, we have three of these kinds of drivers that all require more authoritarian relations, social political relations, in order to accomplish their ends, which are not identical, but are in some ways mutually reinforcing. And one of the things we do know is that the rise of racial and ethnic nationalism is particularly pernicious, and the rise of patriarchy, misogyny, is particularly pernicious to the ability to develop working class solidarity, to the ability to organize working people against concentrations of corporate power. Indeed, one of the functions of racial and ethnic nationalism, of white supremacy, of misogyny, is to disunite the interests of working class people. And so it's important that we put in the conversation the question not only of the sort of platforming of white nationalism, but to begin then to respond to the question about, so what does democracy need in a moment like this? I think there's often a tendency among different sectors of the left to get into sort of either or, kinds of conversations. Do we need universalistic economic justice policies? That's the way we're going to overcome the divisions of white supremacy and misogyny, for instance. Or do we need to fight racial injustice in order to bring about a transformation in the social compact? Or do we need to do these other things? And the answer should never be either or, it should always be yes and. And so I think this part of what we need in order to build sufficient power to avert authoritarianism in its more oligarchic and corporate expressions, in its more white nationalist expressions, and in its more patriarchal and even theocratic expressions are some of the same elements, actually. We need a robust, a multiracial and feminist movement that is a democratic movement that is rooted in the interests of working people, that aspires to transformational change from the workplace right to the White House, right? That understands that these are all sites of contestation in the political economy, and they're all sites of concentration around governance, that corporations are exercising governing level power. And so part of building democracy is acknowledging that the contests in the workplace are not merely economic. And again, I use the term merely very advisedly, not as a diminutive, but to acknowledge that there's so much more at stake than bread and butter issues in terms of the governance issues in the workplace. And so I think that without a kind of holistic notion of building movements, workers' movements, democracy movements, racial justice movements that bring forward a sense of multiracial, feminist, and worker democracy as non-negotiable bottom lines for the transformation we seek. Without that kind of an orientation, we're probably not really talking about building an alternative that can withstand the drivers that are lurching us in a variety of ways towards more authoritarian relations in the United States. There is no separate, I think, worker piece, right, to be won that's somehow independent from these fundamental questions, right, of whether we're going to foreclose on democratic possibility or whether we're going to win a democracy that's worth its name. And so I think that exploding some of the boundaries of what often get, siloed in terms of what worker struggles, what are the parameters or the boundaries of worker struggles in a moment where any mass movement for transformational change that doesn't subconsciously identify itself as part of a deeper democracy movement is probably not thinking big enough. And so I think a big part of this is there's two sides of this equation. One is what's the level of power we need in order to win some of these transformations. The other is what's our vision? How do we avoid the kind of restrictions on our aspirations so that we end up doing the equivalent in the workplace that the social media companies would have us do on the platforms, right? Which is, oh, how do we do harm mitigation as opposed to how do we transform these institutions and social relations into more just ones that can durably reflect our democratic aspirations. And I think that question of vision is really critical here. I'm a non-utopian radical. I know it will be messy and imperfect, but I think that we risk undershooting, what our aspirations are because we've been so ruthlessly disciplined, right, from the period of Reaganism on through the period of Trumpism to expect far less than we all deserve.
That could not be a better setup for me to ask you, Michelle, to talk about one of my favorite things, which is to talk about the moment after Trump was elected and the kinds of worker organizing we saw then, and how it was very much in keeping with what Tarso's talking about here around vision and solidarity. And will you talk a little bit about that?
I will. So yeah, one of the most promising, I think, things that we've seen in worker organizing in many, many years was the way that workers at tech companies responded to the election of Trump in solidarity with the people who would be most impacted by the use of technology to engage in deportations, to enforce the Muslim ban, to create surveillance and drone warfare that would be used on populations around the world. And so what we saw was workers, quite interestingly, was that workers at tech companies like Google and Facebook and to some extent Amazon, and in that context really focused on climate, and Twitter and many other, Oracle too, many other companies were thinking about like, what can we do to ensure that in our work and in our labor, we are remaining accountable to the most impacted communities, specifically under a growing fascist threat. That they use the tools of workplace organizing and of labor organizing in order to start to hold those companies accountable to those standards and to start to pursue a vision of workplace democracy that said, I'm not going to work in a place and I'm going to provide my labor to a place that is contributing significantly to harm. I would argue that those companies were always contributing significantly to harm, and that it became apparent to many of these folks after the election in 2016, but everybody's on their own journey and we're glad they're here. But like what we've seen through that, like that started out as being really organizing that was around the relationships between the tech companies and ICE and the tech companies and DHS and CPV and like all but what we then were able to see was also a transformation in how they also regarded their coworkers across the tech supply chain. So also building solidarity with content moderators, who are the people who are dealing with all of the horrifying racist and violent content that's coming in through Facebook and YouTube, the people who are doing delivery and warehouse work, and people in their own communities that are all part of the kind of like dominant context in which tech is operating. And then I would just like finally say that it's also an example of this kind of transformational thinking that takes multiple years actually to come to fruition. That many of the campaigns that we've seen inside tech companies over the past few years have had like little small wins, but haven't, overnight like transformed them into utopian workplace democracies, but that it is those acts of like, maybe this might work someday, and building the muscle around that actually are the things that get us into a place of transformation on a broader scale.
Thank you. Stacy.
This is such a great conversation. I want to just, I guess, first underscore and offer a rousing here to what Tarso said about vision and about the fact that ultimately all of these fights, all of the stakes of this are about authoritarianism versus democracy. I mean, that is what's here, and I think what we have to understand and embody in all of our thinking and what we're doing. I also wanted to, I guess, in a couple of different ways, circle back to some of the points that Michelle and Dania raised earlier. Michelle, particularly around place-based, face-to-face spaces, public spaces, local businesses, communities, like geographic communities, the places where we actually live. And, in so many ways, the concentration of corporate power and this authoritarianism has obliterated those communities. It has pulled the rug out from under local economies. Tech has intermediated our growing share of our interactions, and so that they're no longer in the place of community, of face-to-face community. And of course, COVID has exacerbated all of this in the last year. But I really think as we think about how do we challenge this, it's really worth thinking about what are the ways in which we strengthen and build place-based institutions and more face-to-face networks. How do we think about that going forward? And just the importance of, those alternative ways of exchanging information with one another, of being in relationship to one another, and of conducting commerce and exchanging goods and governing ourselves and so on, that happen in the context of real places. And then I also wanted to circle back to talking a little bit about small businesses, independent businesses, which I think have, as Dania rightly put it, have been really important spaces for a lot of critical social movements in the past. And for a significant part of the 20th century, we're very much allied with labor in the fight against corporate power. And I think something that we need to think about kind of resurrecting. We've been for a few decades now in a framework where we've thought about business on one side and labor on the other, and business being big and small together. And I think that that is a construct that has worked very well for the US Chamber of Commerce, which promotes that idea very heavily, talks a lot about small business, even as its budget is almost exclusively provided by big business. Its board is almost exclusively big business. Certainly the Republican Party also drives this kind of thinking as well, and I think works quite effectively for them. But I think there's another way of thinking about these relationships, which is to think about the notion that really what we want, I think, is to think about a government policies that disperse power and democratize power, and that there are many avenues by which that can happen. It can happen through unions and strong rules that help people have a voice and a say and a control over their workplaces. It can happen through public ownership and public institutions and investments and things that are directly democratically controlled. And it can happen through creating opportunities for people to be entrepreneurs, to create their own livelihoods and have the freedom and the opportunity to do that. And in that way, I think you begin to see like a framework for thinking about the economy that sees organized labor and small business and public institutions as all tools within a broader strategy, and tools that align well with one another, and that are all arrayed against the centralization of power in the hands of a few, which is fundamentally the thing that is driving the demise of independent businesses that we've seen over the last few years, or the last few decades, I should really say. Small businesses are in an existential crisis, and although a lot of that, it's sort of COVID has been in the fore and has brought more attention, certainly COVID has been more than a stiff wind. But the reason that so many businesses have been so vulnerable in the last year is that they were already on such fragile straits because of concentrated corporate power. And so I think there's a real opportunity right now to think about a politics and a policy and a vision that sort of resurrects, that reintegrates the notion of farmers and small business people and labor all being united, and then does it with an explicitly anti-racist approach, sort of unlike that earlier period that I'm talking about.
Thanks, Stacy. Something I'm thinking about in this piece of our conversation is about who amongst us as people in the United States have been experiencing that kind of the first or the full frontal experience of the authoritarianism, because as we know, it's not distributed equally across communities, across working class communities, across the United States. And so I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which Muslims in the United States in particular have been kind of on the forefront of that, both the NYPD spying scandal and unconstitutional horrendous surveillance, which is such a helpful precursor to the level of surveillance we're talking about around workers. But also in other spaces. And so Ramah, I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about that, and to talk about the importance of Muslims organizing Muslims in light of the last 20 years of American experience.
Thank you, Dania, for that. So, as was mentioned, this particular work I do at ACRE is focused on corporate complicity in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim violence, and particularly thinking about how corporations help fund Islamophobia, how they profit from it, and how they kind of spread it. And, you know, a lot of the examples of corporations we already shared are very, are very clear on that. And I think something to note is, again, especially in the last 20 years, is the ability to kind of justify a lot of this within, while we are fighting quote unquote terrorism, and the acceptance of that. And so I saw a question in the chat, for example, around Facebook and how they're building out for white supremacy. And so these social media platforms, for example, have learned very well how to shut down accounts of Muslim activists or activists showing solidarity with Muslims, or working with governments to, again, shut down, content that they may be bothered for by. I think we're seeing that a lot happening. Again, I think we've mentioned India as an example, and the Hindu fascist government of Modi really clamping down on folks, these social media platforms responding to Modi's requests. Twitter, for example, this last week has like deleted tweets and accounts of people calling out Modi for the lack of response to the current horrific crisis of the pandemic. At the same time, Tarso mentioned Facebook helping, fuel the genocide of Rohingya people in Myanmar. Or YouTube will say, well, we're constantly updating our algorithm to ensure that anti-Muslim content is removed. Again, the removal of it versus like, why is it being uploaded in the first place is always what the solution is. And yet somehow or another, YouTube and these platforms know that when certain videos of terrorist organizations are uploaded, they're immediately shut down. Their accounts are immediately shut down. So why is there the energy to do one thing versus another thing? And where, again, is the dollar money, is the dollar is going? So I think this continued acceptance of certain people and communities, well, their rights are just going to have to go with the flow because this is a problem, a terrorism problem, and it's been accepted. Again, we've been 20 years now almost of the war on terror. It's not over. It's not over because Obama claimed it was over a few years ago. It's a constant. It continues to happen. And these platforms are telling us very clear. They're showing what, who they'll accept, what they're trying to do and what they're not trying to. Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, a couple of years ago actually was like, well, if we do what you all are saying in terms of white supremacist content, that means we would have to like remove Republican content. And then it's like, well, then you have to remove Republican content. Like, what is, why is this a problem? And again, the idea that a lot of times these platforms give up is like they're liberal, they're progressive. It's not true at all based on, again, their business model. So I think that I would throw in there. I think the other thing I would throw in there is just thinking about kind of, again, like we've talked about, again, like, the power of these companies. I think there's obviously also like a revolving door between these tech executives and tech workers and then the government, and then particularly in places like Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, ICE. So all of these things that grew significantly or even were invented in a post 9/11 world. So what does that mean? If like the people, they work in an administration, then they go work at the tech company, then they come back and work in the administration when it's like a friendlier administration based on whatever their political claims, ideologies claim to be. So that's kind of another place where it's just like, well, if you worked in a government space where it was like, here's the enemy, quote unquote, the enemy. And then when you go back into your tech world, that's going to be part of your work beyond just like the money flowing and the board connections and all that. But like, just in terms of ideology, who you decide to listen to and not listen to is very important part of kind of this conversation of how the many different ways this stuff seeps into the way then policies made, the way companies are run, and then who gets impacted. And again, I think in the last 20 years in the shadow of the war on terror, beyond just like the physical assault on Muslim communities that happens both at home, but obviously abroad in terms of very clear war and invasions, that's just a reality that I think we just need to think about, how particular communities have faced some of this horrendous stuff.
Thank you. We're coming up on time. I wish I could sit here with all y'all and hear more questions and more thoughts and make it a bigger conversation. Happily, there's lots to read from all of our panelists and lots of campaigns to get involved in, including ours at Athena. So I'm going to invite some closing thoughts from folks. And say, Ramah, one of the things that you were just saying towards the end made me think about the way in which we're constructing a some folk, not we, but some in our wider community are constructing a conversation about big tech right now that's oriented around identifying a new foreign enemy, like the xenophobia that really infused yesterday's Senate hearing around tech. I suppose it shouldn't be shocking to me now, but remains sort of shocking that, like, considering China an existential threat as opposed to the racism and bias and income and wealth inequality and all of what we've been talking about here as fundamentally American existential threats, suggests to me that there's like a lot of effort in constructing the problems as external and our solutions around people really connected, I think, to the social kinds of and political control of a company town 1.0, where the expectations are clear, the ways in which the company or the police or the Pinkertons will punish you for stepping out of line are clear and known, and that is really so much of the experience of working in this economy, whether you're working at Amazon, you're working as an engineer at Google, or you're working, at DoorDash or Uber, or in a sector poised to be taken over by one of these big companies. So with that, I'll invite sort of a lightning round of closing thoughts, and we'll end at the hour. I'm just gonna go in reverse order of how we started. So Michelle, that puts you up first. Sorry.
But I don't know my closing thought. I will just say the last thing I'll say is that the kind of bright spot here is that if we had been trying to have this conversation 5 or 6 years ago, it would have been a lot harder because we were in a very techno-utopian moment where it was considered kind of like Luddite behavior to project any kind of critique on these companies. And what I think is really promising is both that that due to the company's own behavior, that moment has moved on, and that what we're seeing from people to even to Stacy's point about, finding other places for people to convene and to talk, is that there is actually like a desire among many, many people to create those kinds of spaces and to get away from the reach of these companies. And we can't do anything without people being interested in organizing. And so in that in a fundamental way is like a piece of a kind of silver lining on what's next.
Tarso?
Yeah, I wanna riff, Dania, on something you said, and Michelle referred to this in a way too. There's we talk a lot. There's a popular sort of progressive and liberal notion that the right is animated by nostalgia, about this notion of going back. I actually think we have a lot of nostalgia on the left. And I think that even the example you were giving, Dania, about efforts to sort of center a national security panic around, China and xenophobia is an example of that. I think, among other things, is an attempt to return to a kind of Cold War period of bipartisanship, rooted in the notion of shared interests around resisting an external threat, and try to use that as an internal bridge. And it had horrific consequences in the Cold War period domestically, and we should expect it will have horrific consequences, if this is allowed to become sort of a nostalgic paradigm imposed on the current moment. And I think this is part of what I mean by vision. I don't mean in the sense of sort of just a utopianism. I really mean that we have to get away from reflexive nostalgia and thinking that solutions that didn't serve us very well actually in the 20th century are somehow going to come to the rescue, right? At the early part of the 21st century. And I do think that we have seen over the past couple of years, and a number of people spoke to this, new models of solidarity, cross-racial, cross-class, pan-religious and other forms of solidarity that I actually think, put some wind at our backs in terms of thinking about different models for imagining who the we is, that doesn't require and in fact overtly rejects the kind of othering, models of developing kind of false unity. And so I do think that there are real lessons in the immediate past history in the United States that suggest the way forward more than, sort of a revival of Lutheranism in the workplace or a Cold War, posture for bipartisanship or any of these things that are being tested out real time right now. I think we just have to reject them and understand that they're not going to lead us to a radically egalitarian set of relationships along the lines of what Stacy was describing. They take us backwards into the territory that I think Ramos was describing. And so I think maybe that's a core part of our question, right? If so much of the question of building working class power is the question of on what basis is solidarity built, maybe a way to think about continuing this conversation past its expiration in a couple of minutes is the question of what's the base, what have we learned in the last few years about the basis of a solidarity that we think can actually hold and lead us forward in building working class power.
Stacy.
Yeah, this is great. I think, Dania, to your point, that the way most people experience life is one of coercion, coercion in their day-to-day lives, primarily by their employer, obviously, and also just an incredibly sense of despair at the fact that they feel that the place that they live and their surrounding community is at the mercy of external forces that they have no control over, a variety of different kinds of predatory and extractive and authoritarian kinds of forces, if you will. And I think that there is like a real, palpable sense of that. And I think what is encouraging about this moment versus say 5 years ago is not only are we a lot more skeptical about tech, but there is much more of the conversation is about the underlying structures and systems of power. I feel like I am not in conversations about symptoms anymore, which it seemed like I was exclusively in some years ago. And now there's more and more in conversations that are about what is the underlying distribution of power, of decision making, and also to Tarso's point, more and more of a sense of vision and like, no, we should be thinking really big and really radically, fundamentally about what it is that we're trying to do here. Two more like just to ground it a little bit, 2 more points of hope. There is going to be legislation in Congress to break up and regulate big tech. We're actively involved in that. Would love to have other people get involved. It's a serious threat to the companies and a lot of opportunity to deal with a significant structural issue and to revive anti-monopoly as a set of tools for democracy. And then the last thing I'll say is that at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, our sort of tagline is building local power to fight corporate control. And I'm just amazed across the work that we've been doing at how many different places you've got communities that are building publicly owned broadband networks and working towards having more community banks and credit unions and, just in a variety of ways, actually, creating the structures of an alternate system that is more democratically controlled. And so that I also take a lot of hope from. There is a vast sort of anti-corporate, anti-monopoly movement that doesn't always go by that name or recognize itself as such, but that's happening out there in a lot of places. And I'll drop a couple of links in for people who want to be more in touch with our work.
There could not be a better setup for Smiley's part, I think, of the plenary tonight with Bill Spriggs and Will Jones. And with that, Lean, I turn this back to you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Cal Manowitz, for hosting our conversation. And thank you, panelists.
Terrific. Wow. What a discussion. Thank all of you for being here. And thanks to our audience for coming to today as well. This is just the first day. We have 4 days for this convening. Please join us for other sessions, including that's right tonight. We're doing a roundtable discussion. I'm going to moderate it about getting it right this time on the new social compact. Thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you over the next several days.
Thank you.